Good morning, everyone. I want to say a special word of welcome to those of you worshiping with us in Amesbury. I hope you're having a great morning and an awesome time of worship as you gather there in the name of Christ. Today, we're continuing this series as we talk more and more about this whole concept of the God of second chances. And today, we're looking at the story of Job. Now, Job has got to be the ultimate story of personal tragedy. I mean, if you know the story at all, you know that Job was a man who was really blessed in so many ways. He had worldly wealth. He had, it tells at the beginning how many cows and camels and sheep and donkey and all that he owned, and that was all just a sort of a sign of the richness of how God had blessed him in a worldly way. And it talks about his family, what a great family he had. I think he had 7 sons and 3 daughters and a loving wife and all of that. And in fact, not only did he have these great kids, but they were good kids. They celebrated life. They shared life together. They were just richly blessed as a family. He was a man of good reputation, highly regarded in his community, and just really, well established there. And he was even a man of deep faith. And so he had all these worldly things going for him, but he also was a man who was connected to God and who was strong of God and who lived a righteous life and all of that. So really, it's like Job has it all. Every aspect of his life is just going great. All the things we might hope for, to enjoy wonderful things of this world, have a great family, good reputation, highly regarded, and a great, strong faith. In fact, as you read the story, you might even go so far as to say that it seemed as though his life was what we might call today charmed. It seemed like everything he put his hand to went well. Everything was successful. Everything was blessed, really, and that's really what it was. Everything he put his hand to seemed to be blessed of God. God had covered him with his protection, and he had blessed his work, and everything about it seemed to have God's stamp of approval on it. And in response, Job was righteous in his life, and he was faithful. He stood by God, and he was strong of faith and all of that. And so this combination of blessing and God's hand of protection combined with Job's faithfulness caused the devil to ask God a question. And it's a question I think the world sometimes asks about us as believers, as followers of Christ. And that question was Job's faithfulness the response to God's blessing? In other words, was Job faithful because God had blessed him? Was Job righteous and living for God because God's hand of protection had been upon him, because God seemed to have given him everything? And would he really have been so faithful if God's hand of blessing had not been on him so richly? If he had not received so much from the hand of God? And so the devil asked that question, and I think it's a question that the world might ask of us today as they see someone who seems to be strong of faith and yet also seems to have a lot going for them, seems to have a lot of things of the world, and they might wonder, are they faithful because of what God's done for them? And so, to address the devil's question, and I think actually to give a lesson, to teach something that would be passed on from generation to generation of believers in order to sort of address this question of whether that faithfulness was dependent upon God's hand of blessing, or should it be, for a season, God removed from Job his hand of blessing, his hand of protection. And so in a very short time, Job loses his wealth. Raiders come and take all of this, and armies come and take all of that, and pretty soon all of his worldly possessions have been stolen from him. And on top of that, tragedy strikes his family. His children die. And then, as if that were not enough, even his health begins to fail. And so by the time his friends get wind, because like I said, this all happens very quickly. By the time some of his friends hear about what has happened to poor Job, they come upon him, and as they're coming to him from a distance, they look and they see what is really a shell of the man that he once was, just a week or two perhaps before. They come, I mean, it's an awful scene in some ways. They come upon him, and there he is, just sort of sitting in the dust, a broken man, everything taken from him. And he describes it. He said he sat there scraping the sores from his body with a piece of broken pottery as he sits there in the dirt, in the dust. Broken. It's a tragic picture. And the one family member that he still has left, his wife, says to him, "Why don't you curse God and die?" That's a tough place. That is a difficult place to be in that moment when it's gotten to the point where even your wife says, "Why don't you curse God and die?" See, Job refused to curse God. He would not blame God. He did not curse God when all this tragedy bestowed. In fact, he said, "When God was good to me, wasn't I willing to receive it?" The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now, my prayer certainly is that none of us would face the kind of extraordinary tragedy that Job faced. But the reality is that many of us have been through tragedy. Many of you in this room have been through loss. You've been through significant hardship. Very few of us actually over the course of our lives will be immune to that kind of struggle. Sooner or later we're going to know what it is to face the loss of a loved one. We're going to know what it is to face some sort of tragedy or some difficult thing. Many of us at some point in our lifetime will lose our jobs and wonder how we're going to pay the bills. Some of us will even get to that place, and we've seen this a lot in the last few years, where we get so far behind financially that we lose our homes. There's a whole new emerging group of homeless that are people that just a few years ago had nice homes and were gainfully employed, and just over the course of years got deeper and deeper until they lost everything. Many of you in this room know what it is to lose a loved one. Now, some of those were lost in the course of a good and long life, but some were taken prematurely, tragically. And so, even though we may not have been through everything that Job went through, I think many of us understand his struggle. Many of us know what it is to experience loss and hardship. Some of us have even gone through that final stage that Job went through, where we've had significant health concerns, ways that our body has begun to be stricken, if you will, and we've had to walk that path. And while Job does refuse to curse God, because that's what his wife suggested, right? You know, that she knows that, if you would just curse God, he would strike you dead and your misery would be over. And so she literally says to him, "Curse God and die." Well, Job refuses to curse God. But if you go a little ways into the story, you find he does get to the point where he curses the day he was born. He regrets that he ever was brought into life. And you can see in that lament this depth of despair, this sorrowing, this sadness that he is just weighed down by. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been through something that in the midst of it was so hard, was so sorrowful, was so grievous to you, that you literally got to the point of despairing of life? Where you just felt overwhelmed and felt like there was no way out? As I said, I think many of us have been through our times of struggle. I want to tell you a story about a man from our church. When we first launched The Rock, fairly early on in the journey, we've been at this, 13 years or something. Fairly early on in the journey, a couple came through our door. And the husband, his name was Bill Ireland. And Bill immediately jumped in. These were faithful Christian folks that God had just kind of brought our way, and we were thankful for the gift of that. We were in the early stages, and we needed good leadership, and we needed some strong Christian folks. We were reaching a lot of unchurched, but it was good to have once in a while some folks come through the door who actually had a foundation of faith already and could be mentors to others, and that's the kind of guy that Bill was. Bill was a strong Christian man. He was an engineer, so like many engineers, very thoughtful and what have you, but that never deterred him from his faith. And so Bill got involved fairly quickly, and he and Grace both, and he was very involved in the initial work towards beginning the building fund and project and looking at sites and all that before we ever even bought the land where the church sits now. He was a part of the early stages of that and helping that develop. And in fact, Bill was the person who directed, who built up the very first building fund that we had as a church. He launched our first building fund and headed up the campaign for that. Bill was a good man. And he and Grace had a wonderful life together, beautiful children, now at that point grown, young adult children. And one year, we used to take these trips to Nashville, Tennessee. There was a music conference down there a number of us would go to. And one year, Bill and Grace went with us to this music and worship conference. And while we were there, Bill started to not feel well. In fact, one of the days, it was only a 3-day conference, one of the days he stayed back at the hotel and just stayed resting in bed. And, we didn't think too much of it in the time. We just assumed that, maybe a bug or something. Well, when he came home, we discovered that he still really wasn't feeling well. And so we went to the doctor and began to be checked out. And long story short, Bill was actually quite ill. And within a matter of months, Bill had passed away. Now here Grace and Bill are at the prime of their life. Their children have just really, in the last few years, gotten out of the house, and they're enjoying their life together. And from nowhere comes tragedy. Comes this substantial loss. And for Grace, this was her Job moment. This was her moment to understand, to feel and experience what it was to lose someone so close. And it was hard. And it was sad. And we grieved with her, and we celebrated Bill's life. I'll never forget his memorial service. We did it at St. Matt's. The choir sang. It was a celebration of life, and we gave thanks for who Bill was. But nonetheless, Grace had been left with a large gap in her life. And this sense that something so precious had been taken from her. And if you've ever been there, if you've ever walked that particular journey, you know what it is to feel as if life as I've known it is over. Things will never really be the same, that it will always, from this point forward, feel as though there's something missing, something tragic has been lost. And it's in those moments that we particularly need to remind ourselves that we serve a God of second chances. I believe that even in our tragedies, even in our hardships, even in those times that are most difficult, that I believe God will bring us a second chance. And I'm sure that deep down Grace believed that as well, even though in the moment it just seems so overwhelming. But I think the hard part of that is, the difficult part of even believing in those moments that we serve a God of second chances, is just imagining how we will ever get past this moment. How do we move forward? Even if we've come to believe that God does have something more for us, even if we in our minds can tell us that, how do we get to that place? Because the reality is that when you're in the middle of it, when you're going down that path, that journey, there is just an overwhelming weight of that. There is a sadness, a grieving that comes with that often makes it difficult to move forward, to see hope, to believe that there can be possibility. And so how do we do that? How do we get to that place? If you're in the midst of that right now, how do we get to that place of believing that God can be a God of second chances? When we've gone through tragedy like Job did, when we've gone through loss like Grace did, how do we get to that place of believing that our God can be a God of second chances? How do we get past the moment, the hardship of it all? I think the Job story actually gives us some insight. I think we see some things in him that help us to understand and to know how best to do that. First of all, the first thing I would say is we must not abandon God. I'm going to turn for a minute to Job chapter 1, verse 21, and then 2, verse 10. Naked I came into the world, and naked I will depart from it. The Lord gave, and the Lord takes away. May the name of the Lord be praised. See what he's doing there? Even in his tragedy, even in his struggle, he is not abandoning God. And also in chapter 2, verse 10. And he replied, this is when his wife wanted him to curse God and die, he replied, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" And in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. You see, often when we go through tragedy, our human nature is to want to turn away from God. We want to be angry at God. We want to reject God. We feel as though somehow that God has left us or not helped us when we needed him. And so sometimes our response when we go through the hardship is to distance ourselves from God. And the one thing we must not do is abandon God in our times of tragedy. God is our rock. He's our place of refuge. He's the one we must hold tight to. And so the first thing we learn from Job is that when we go through those times of tragedy, as we are trying to work through them to that new place that God has for us, the one thing we must not do is abandon God. We cannot let go of God. We cannot begin to turn back from God. Even if we're upset. Even if we're hurt. Even if we don't understand. The second thing I think we see in Job is to learn to surround ourselves with people who can be supportive, people who can walk with us through this journey. In chapter 2, verse 13, it talks about his friends who came, and one of the things I find particularly interesting about that little piece is that it says that for a week, for 7 days, they sat there with him and said nothing. Isn't that amazing? Can you imagine that? They just were there for him. They just sat there and they listened and they wept with him perhaps and they held him and they comforted him, but they said nothing. And so I think even for us on the other side of it, when we're the one who's called upon to comfort someone who's going through tragedy, sometimes we worry, well, what am I going to say? Sometimes you don't need to say anything. Sometimes we just need people who will be with us, and that's what they had. And so in Job, we see that example that we also need to surround ourselves with people who will just be with us, who will carry us through, who will walk with us on that journey. Now, eventually they did speak, and Job, after that, goes through this very difficult phase, and he does begin to become angry with God, and he cries out, and his friends go back and forth between being supportive and yet pressing him, holding him accountable, and saying, you know what you believe about God. You really want to go there. And so they hold him accountable. They press him. Sometimes they just listen. They find that in-between place to be good counsel, but also to be supportive friend. And so as we go through this thing, as we try to walk this journey of tragedy, certainly we don't want to abandon God. We do want to take those people that God has put in our lives and allow them in, allow them to be a support and a hope, allow them to just sit with us if that's what we need. And the third thing I think we learn from Job is simply to be patient, to hang in there. I think we all know that God's timing is not our timing. And I think when we've gone through something difficult, we'd like God to fix it immediately. But it doesn't always work that way. And so we learn, and Job does hang in there, and he wrestles through it. And sometimes he is angry, and sometimes he does cry out, and you see the struggle of it all, but he stays with it, and he works through it. And so we learn that patience and that perseverance from Job. I would say there's probably one other thing that I'd want to note in this story. And that is that it's okay to be honest with God. Job was honest with God. Job was hurt. Job was angry. There were times he went through times of confusion and not really understanding what had happened and why and all of that. And he cries out to God, and he speaks to God strongly, and sometimes that's okay. It's okay to be honest with God. I mean, he knows what you feel anyways. He knows what you're thinking. So it doesn't help any if what you're feeling inside is hurt or anger or confusion. To try to pretend before God is meaningless. God knows your heart. So we might as well just be honest with God and say, Lord, I'm struggling with this. I'm having a hard time with this. Why did you allow my husband to die? Why did that child, my cousin, have to die prematurely? Why did we have to go through this time of financial loss? Why did I lose my job? Why can't I find anything else? Why did we lose our home? Why am I going through this health struggle? It's okay. It's okay. God understands. Sometimes we struggle. Sometimes we get upset, and God is a big God, and He's able to handle our emotions, and He's able to understand that sometimes it's just hard. Now, most of the story of Job is a painful, tragic story. But as it comes near the end, chapters and chapters, 40 chapters long, as it comes near the end, Job finally, in chapter 42, comes to a place of acceptance. He repents of the way he railed against God, of his anger, of his disbelief, and all of that. And he speaks that to God, and he acknowledges, Lord, I understand. Your ways are higher than my ways. And I won't always understand why things had to happen the way they do. But I'm still going to trust you. And so he comes to this place of acceptance. That even though he doesn't understand why things had to happen, he is still able to trust God and to walk with Him. And then we come to the final section of the book. the last little piece, after 42 chapters of struggle and hardship and pain and all of that, we come to chapter 42, verse 10. After Job, God actually instructs Job to pray for his friends because his friends didn't come to the same place of repentance. After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortune and gave him twice as much as he had before. All his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before came and ate with him in his house. They comforted and consoled him over all the trouble the Lord had brought upon him, and each one gave him a piece of silver and a gold ring. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation. And so Job died, an old man and full of years. When Job was in the midst of his struggle, it was difficult to see how God could ever redeem him. How God could ever redeem that situation, how he could ever restore his life. And often we feel that same way. When we are in the midst of the struggle, when we're going through the hardship, we wonder, how could God possibly redeem this? But our God is a God of second chances. Now I want to end by going back to the story I told a few minutes ago. Remember the story of Bill and Grace was left as a widow. And I think at that point in her life, assumed that she would live out the rest of her life as a widow. But as God would have it, he brought a wonderful man into her life, Peter. Peter's a pastor. And Peter and his wife, who had also passed away, had been friends many years earlier with Bill and Grace. And so each of them found themselves widowed, reconnected, built a great relationship, and today are married and have a wonderful life together, are doing great things for God. And God has restored them, both of them. And so in that, we see beautifully illustrated that God is a God of second chances. I'm going to invite Jamie to come and just lead us in prayer.